things that is really exciting about Wrath of the Lich King is the fact that the level up content really involves the villain of the story. Arthas shows up along the way as you're leveling up through all the zones, and kind of is part of that story of like doing his nefarious things throughout Northrend. And you encounter him on your way as you're trying to like level through and figure out what's going on and unravel the story so that you can confront him at the end.
Also, I'd add Death Knights. It's the hero class that you get to play for Wrath of the Lich King. It was the first hero class we ever made in World of Warcraft, and this is a special class that actually starts at level 55, so you don't actually have to start at the beginning. It's more of an accelerated situation. You get to play as this armored knight of death, very similar to the villain himself, Arthas. You use a runic power system to vanquish your enemies and get out there and defeat some of the toughest foes in the game.
Yeah, it's actually really exciting. One of the changes that we're making this time with Death Knights is that we're making sure that everybody has a chance to have one. Originally, they were restricted to only one per realm, and you had to have a level 55 already on that realm. And that restriction will remain for your subsequent Death Knights, but for everybody's first Death Knight, we wanted to make sure that anybody who was coming back, who remembered Death Knights fondly, maybe remembered Wrath of the Lich King fondly, maybe this is when they started playing, and they wanted to jump right in and start playing right away on their Death Knight. We wanted to make sure they had a chance to do that, even if they haven't played Classic so far. I would say it falls a little bit more on the, like, we're trying to figure out what the right way to do this is. It's a little more than some changes in that we realize that as we go further and further closer to Modern, that we are introducing some of the things that we like deliberately took out in order to refresh Classic. So a really good example of that is the Dungeon Finder. We realize, like, we have always planned that, like, not having Dungeon Finder in Classic felt like what was part of Classic. And while it's a really cool tool for when you want to play a quick dungeon over lunch, and we're really excited that that continues to be available in Modern, we know that the Classic audience is more interested in that kind of long-term social engagement, that feeling that comes from reaching out to people, talking to them about how you're going to group, trying to coordinate who's going to do what role, walking to the dungeon together, maybe, trying to figure out how you're going to get to the dungeon, who's going to summon, maybe you run into a PvP fight on the way, and then you finally get in there and you have friends that kind of stick together with you. And so even though it was introduced in the final patch of Wrath of the Lich King, we don't feel like it fits in Classic, and so we are not going to include the Dungeon Finder. But that said, we do realize that there are grouping tools that could use some improvement. The Burning Crusade Looking for Group tool that we have available right now in Burning Crusade Classic is, one of those ones that it could use a little bit of a improvement to try to make sure that there's better ways of trying to interact with people and make sure that you can find groups. The chat channel, of course, is still available, the Looking for Group chat channel that people use, and we want to make sure that we make improvements to kind of like guide people to both of those avenues so that they are, comfortable finding other people on their realm to make groups with.
Yeah, I think a big thing is just listening to the community and recognizing how it's different from the Modern community versus the original Classic community. When we embarked on Classic, it was definitely no changes. We want to make it for what that community was, and it didn't exist in its form today, so we just went with what it was when it originally launched. And obviously it's evolved over time. People want slightly different things. They don't want what our Modern game wants. That offers one thing, Classic offers another, and Wrath in particular, there's definitely certain changes that people are looking for us to investigate, look at, or make. And I think that's what the beta period's for. It really helps us deep dive into how people are playing the game, how they're engaging with it, and what changes they're requesting. We can make some good decisions based on that, rather than just hold true to the, nope, we're not changing anything, this is how it is.
Sure, I would say the biggest challenge technically with Wrath is, we did make some changes during Burning Crusade. And so we have our data from Burning Crusade that we have, now the Burning Crusade Classic version of the data. And it, of course, looks a little bit different than the original Burning Crusade data. But most importantly is that it's in a different format. Like, we've talked about this, that what we did is we took the original data, we transformed it to the format that the Modern code expects. But the Modern code is changing, and the format of the data that it expects is changing. And of course, it was changing back then too. So we originally took the Classic data, transformed it to the Modern format at that time, and then we took the Burning Crusade data, which was different than the Classic data, transformed it to the Modern data at that time, which wasn't the same as the Modern data from the classic transformation. And each time it gets more complicated because now we're dealing with really 6 versions of the data and trying to make sure that, okay, this change happened on this table, but that actually is represented on this other table in the modern data now. So we have to make sure we track that change. Don't stomp the change to the content we made in Burning Crusade. So it's really kind of a juggling act to make sure that we're trying to thread the needle of like all these places that various changes have been made for various reasons and make sure that we get the right version for Wrath of the Lich King.
Yeah, Wrath also had some really big, almost an evolution in technology for the game itself too. Like we added things like the achievement system, which really changed fundamentally how a lot of the game was played. It added an extra element of directed gameplay or boss variability into it. We included vehicles. That was a new piece of technology for Wrath of the Lich King as well. Some of that was used in encounters, like the first one at Old War or even Malagos when you're on the floating discs. It was kind of cool to move around the world in a different way. And phasing was also another thing that was relatively new for that. Like you could progress through the story of a zone and see it change in front of your eyes when it may have begun as a war-torn area, and then you start to help win the war or swing the tide, and suddenly the world around you changes too. So these were all really important, iconic, technical leaps that we took in Wrath of the Lich King, and all of those will be preserved for this.
We are not going to let people stay in Burning Crusade who want to this time. We really didn't have a lot of uptick and interest in that, but we are going to make sure that we continue to preserve the original classic version of the game. We know that some people really did want just that version, and so that version is going to continue to exist. But as we continue, like the Burning Crusade version will just transition into the Wrath of the Lich King version, and there will not be another choice or clone service offered as we did with the original Burning Crusade release.
I think something else we've observed is people want to experience certain eras of WoW in the progression style that is meaningful, and Burning Crusade has done that, and so the people that are looking for the expansion progression will continue on to Wrath. But we've experimented with things like Season of Mastery, which lets you relive the classic experience, even though we have our evergreen classic servers that people remain on too. So I think there's opportunities in the future to look at different seasonal content we can provide to people who are looking for, I really want to revisit BC, or I really want to revisit Classic again, or maybe we can do this in a little different way. It's something we're always keeping an eye on to see what we could do.
It does seem like most people want to move on to the latest content, and that makes sense. There's a lot of people who come in for it, and then they level through it, and they get to the end, and they're wanting more. And so what we see consistently is that people want to do more stuff. And I mean, that makes sense, that once you've finished playing through a game, obviously, what do you want? A sequel. And so it makes sense that people will want to do more things. But at the same time, like, what are those things, and what comes with those things is the thing that we want to pay attention to, and make sure that we don't do things that make it feel not like Classic. We want to continue to appeal to these two different audiences and to try to find a way to service them both with additional content.
I think it's important to preserve a healthy community for everything we offer, and we feel like we do have that. If you're playing just pure Classic World of Warcraft versus Wrath of the Lich King versus Dragonflight, or even Season of Mastery, there's a healthy community in each of those, and that's what's critical to us, is to make sure that we're preserving that.
Yes, specifically, what we're going to do is make sure that gender change is available in the barbershop. That's the thing that we want to make sure that we add, because we feel like that's important for our community to have that as an option that is for gold and not for real money.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of a question you asked earlier about what things have we done in modern World of Warcraft that we can bring into Classic, and this was something that was just a universally praised change. It was something that our players wanted. Good representation and accessibility feature where it's like, of course we want to include this. This is in the best interest of the players, and we're excited to bring it to them for just the in-game cost of gold.
Yeah, and also just that we're generally inclusive. And a conversation about that came up recently was that the new human racial that's introduced in Wrath of the Lich King was originally called Every Man for Himself. And it's a subtle thing, but we just said like, we now call that, I think it's, Will to Survive. And we were like, that actually sounds cooler. And it's more inclusive also. So like, let's go with that. And it makes sense. Like there's no reason that the specific name of that ability was important to how you played Wrath of the Lich King. And so we can just be more inviting to a larger audience of people while still preserving the gameplay that everybody's there to experience.
Well, one of the things I've appreciated about this entire process is it's really been an exercise in listening to our team and just hearing feedback from all the developers that work on the game about things that they like raise an eyebrow to versus things that they just think were okay or part of the content. And it's really good that we're able to take action on those things that feel like we wouldn't make that decision today. Let's make sure we're not shipping a game with something that we wouldn't have done.
I think that's a great question. I think it really gets into the heart of like that dichotomy between going on to modern World of Warcraft and trying to stay in Classic, and how like you brought up Cataclysm as a way that like as a breaking point that everybody kind of looks at. But what we're realizing right now, and what we've kind of thought about all along, is that it actually starts in Wrath of the Lich King with things like Dungeon Finder and the things like multiple raid difficulties. There are things that start to pull up the things that we took out intentionally for Classic. And so we're trying to find that balancing point where we can preserve the Classic feeling and still make sure that we're giving people new things to do. Because it is that, obviously you're going to play through it again, you're going to get to the end of it, and you're going to say like, I want more. More what? Well, what do we have? And so we're going to try to make sure that we find something that is satisfying to people, that gives them something more to do, and also feels as much as we can like Classic originally. And whether or not that's Cataclysm or something else in the future is something we have not decided today, and we definitely want to hear feedback from the community. We know we're going to Wrath of the Lich King. We know we're going to be able to do that in a way that we feel is true to the Classic spirit, and we're excited to hear what people want to see next.
This entire game has been a love letter to the fans. Ever since we decided to make Classic World of Warcraft originally, it was how do we give the fans what they've been asking for and what they want? Our players are key and important to this experience. And so when we did Classic, we heard people wanted no changes. When we shipped Classic, we really focused on that. We weren't even thinking about the next step necessarily, but almost immediately people said, we want Burning Crusade. And after we shipped Burning Crusade, people almost immediately said, Wrath, that's like such a cool expansion. Can't wait to play that. So really, we're going to continue to have our focus on Wrath and making sure that that's an amazing expansion for the players. But then we'll take that moment afterwards to pause and listen and see what players are saying, what they're thinking, and what they're feeling.